When Sarah got sick, the doctors told us to find things that brought her joy. She'd always loved flowers, so I spent 3 months turning our front yard into the most beautiful garden our neighborhood had ever seen. Roses, lavender, sunflowers, and her favorite daisies filled every corner. She would sit by the window every morning with her tea, watching the butterflies dance from bloom to bloom. Then the HOA destroyed it all in a single afternoon. I came home from the hospital that Tuesday to find our yard stripped bare, not a single flower left, just churned dirt and tire tracks where bulldozers had been. Sarah's garden was gone, and with it, the last thing that made her smile during those final weeks. But what the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association didn't know was that I'd been quietly buying up properties in our neighborhood for months, and I was about to own something they needed desperately. Let me back up. Sarah and I moved to Willowbrook Estates 15 years ago. It was supposed to be our forever home. A quiet suburban neighborhood with tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors. The HOA seemed reasonable back then. They kept the common areas nice and enforced basic rules about lawn care and exterior paint colors. Nothing too crazy. Sarah had always wanted a proper flower garden, but life kept getting in the way. Work, travel, home repairs, there was always something else demanding our attention. When the doctors diagnosed her with stage 4 pancreatic cancer last spring, everything changed. Suddenly, none of those other things mattered. Woof! The oncologist was gentle but direct. 6 months to a year, maybe less. Sarah took the news better than I did. That night, she sat on her back porch and told me about all the things she wanted to do with whatever time we had left. At the top of her list was finally planting that garden she dreamed about. I took a leave of absence from work the next day. We spent hours at the nursery, Sarah, picking out plants like she was choosing colors for a masterpiece. She wanted native flowers that would attract butterflies and bees. She wanted herbs that would make the whole yard smell like heaven. She wanted something beautiful that would outlast her. The transformation took 3 months. I hired a landscape designer who worked with Sarah to create something truly special. We installed irrigation, built raised beds, and planted over 200 different varieties of flowers and herbs. The front yard became a living rainbow that changed with the seasons. Sarah's energy was fading, but she insisted on helping with every detail. She'd direct me from her wheelchair, pointing out exactly where each plant should go. The neighbors would stop during their evening walks to admire our progress. Even Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down, who usually kept to herself, would bring Sarah lemonade and stay to chat about gardening. The garden was finished in late August. Sarah cried when she saw it in full bloom for the first time. Monarch butterflies were already making themselves at home among the milkweed. Hummingbirds darted between the bee balm and cardinal flowers. It was everything she'd imagined and more. That's when Margaret Thornfield showed up. Margaret was the president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA, a position she'd held for over a decade. She was the kind of person who measured her neighbor's grass with a ruler and sent violation notices for mailboxes that were slightly off-center. Sarah used to joke that Margaret had turned neighborhood management into a full-time occupation. Margaret knocked on our door on a Tuesday morning in September, clipboard in hand and a stern expression on her face. She informed me that our garden violated Section 4.2 of the Community Guidelines, which stated that front yard landscaping must maintain a neat, uniform appearance consistent with suburban standards. I explained that we'd followed all local ordinances and hadn't violated any actual rules. The garden was well maintained, beautiful, and certainly neater than most lawns in the neighborhood. But Margaret wasn't interested in reason. She handed me a formal violation notice and gave me 30 days to restore the front yard to its original condition. 30 days to destroy the last thing that brought joy to my dying wife. I hired a lawyer immediately. The community guidelines were vague and hadn't been updated since the neighborhood was built. More importantly, we'd received approval from the city for all our landscaping work. The HOA had no legal authority to force us to remove plants that were perfectly legal and properly maintained. But Margaret had other plans. While my lawyer was preparing our case, Margaret was busy rallying support from other board members. She sent letters to every household in the neighborhood, claiming that our garden was negatively affecting property values and setting a dangerous precedent for community standards. She called it an eyesore and suggested that allowing such excessive landscaping would turn Willowbrook Estates into a chaotic mess of uncontrolled vegetation. Most of our neighbors ignored her complaints. In fact, many of them told me privately that they loved Sarah's garden and thought Margaret was being ridiculous. But a few longtime residents bought into her arguments. Worried about their home values and the precedent we might be setting, the harassment escalated quickly. Margaret started driving by our house multiple times a day, taking photos of the garden from different angles. She measured the height of our sunflowers and documented every bee that visited our lavender. She even hired a surveyor to confirm that none of our plants extended beyond our property line. When her intimidation tactics didn't work, she got creative. In October, we received a citation from the city for allegedly violating water usage restrictions. The citation was bogus. We had drought-resistant plants and an efficient irrigation system that used less water than most lawns. But fighting it required time and money we didn't have. Sarah was getting weaker, spending more time in the hospital, and I was juggling medical appointments with legal meetings. Then came the anonymous complaints. Margaret, or someone working with her, started calling code enforcement with false reports about our property. They claimed we had dangerous plants that were attracting pests. They said our irrigation system was leaking and creating puddles on the sidewalk. They even reported that our garden was hiding structural damage to our home's foundation. Each complaint triggered an inspection. Each inspection found no violations, but the stress was overwhelming. Sarah would watch from her hospital bed as city workers tramped through her garden, measuring and photographing everything she'd worked so hard to create. Ever been in a situation like this? You'll know exactly how I felt, like the system was designed to exhaust us into submission. By November, Sarah was too weak to come home. She spent her last weeks in hospice care, staring out the window at a parking lot instead of the garden she loved. I brought her photos every day, showing her how the autumn flowers were blooming and how the winter preparations were coming along. She died on a Tuesday in December, exactly 8 months after her diagnosis. I was numb with grief, barely functioning enough to handle the funeral arrangements and legal paperwork that comes with losing a spouse. The last thing I wanted to deal with was Margaret Thornfield and her vendetta against my wife's garden. But Margaret wasn't done with me yet. 3 days after Sarah's funeral, while I was still wearing my black suit and sorting through sympathy cards, Margaret showed up at my door with a sheriff's deputy and a court order. The HOA had won a summary judgment against me while I was focused on my wife's final days. The judge had ruled that our garden violated community standards and had to be removed immediately. I later learned that Margaret had scheduled the hearing for the exact day of Sarah's funeral, knowing I wouldn't be able to attend. My lawyer had filed for a continuance, but the judge denied it. Margaret's lawyer argued that I'd had months to comply with the violation notice and that further delays would only encourage other residents to ignore HOA rules. The sheriff's deputy was apologetic but firm. I had 24 hours to begin removing the garden, or the HOA would hire contractors to do it for me and bill me for the cost. I spent that night in Sarah's garden, sitting among the dormant flower beds and bare branches, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't afford to fight the judgment. The legal fees had already drained most of our savings, and Sarah's medical bills were still coming in. I was emotionally and financially exhausted. But I also couldn't let them destroy the last thing Sarah had created. That's when I remembered something my real estate agent had mentioned months earlier, back when Sarah was first diagnosed and we were considering selling the house. He'd told me that several properties in Willowbrook Estates were going up for sale, including some commercial lots that bordered our neighborhood. I spent the next morning making phone calls. The lot I was interested in was a small commercial property right at the entrance to Willowbrook Estates. It had been home to a gas station decades ago. But the business had closed years earlier and the lot had sat empty ever since. The property was zoned for commercial use and sat just outside the HOA's jurisdiction. More importantly, it was the location of the original well that supplied water to our entire neighborhood. The current owner was asking for much more than I could afford, but he was motivated to sell. The property had been sitting empty for 5 years, generating nothing but tax bills and maintenance costs. When I explained my situation, he agreed to owner financing with a reasonable down payment. I signed the papers that afternoon, just hours before Margaret's contractors were scheduled to arrive. But I didn't tell Margaret about my purchase yet. Instead, I let her proceed with her plan. I watched from my living room window as the bulldozers rolled into my front yard. They worked methodically, ripping up every plant Sarah had chosen, destroying every raised bed we'd built together, erasing 8 months of love and care in a single afternoon. The workers were just doing their job, but Margaret stood on the sidewalk the entire time, supervising every detail like she was conducting an orchestra. She took photos of the destruction, probably for her HOA newsletter. She even brought a folding chair so she could watch in comfort. When it was over, she knocked on my door one final time. She handed me a bill for the contractor costs, nearly $8,000, and informed me that the HOA would file a lien against my property if I didn't pay within 30 days. Then she made her mistake. Margaret smiled as she looked at the bare dirt where Sarah's garden used to be, and she told me this was what happened when people thought they were above community standards. She said that maybe now other residents would think twice before trying to turn their yards into jungle experiments. That's when I told her about the commercial lot I'd just purchased. The smile disappeared from her face as I explained that I now owned the property where our neighborhood's main water line connected to the city system. I mentioned that the original easement agreement between the gas station and the HOA had expired 3 years ago, and no one had bothered to renew it. I also mentioned that commercial property owners were entitled to fair compensation when utilities crossed their land. Margaret's face went white. She stammered something about checking with the HOA's lawyer and hurried back to her car. The next morning, I received a panicked phone call from the HOA's attorney. He'd spent all night researching the property records and had discovered what I already knew. The neighborhood's water access was legally questionable without a current easement agreement. The attorney explained that shutting off water to the entire neighborhood would create massive liability issues for everyone involved, including me. He was right, of course. I had no intention of actually cutting off anyone's water supply. That would hurt innocent neighbors who had nothing to do with Margaret's crusade. But I did have every right to charge fair market rates for the easement. The commercial lot was assessed at $200,000, 0 cents. Industry standard easement fees typically run about 2% of property value annually. That meant the HOA owed me roughly $4,000, 0 cents, per year for the right to run their water line across my land. But that wasn't the revenge I had in mind. Instead, I made the HOA an offer. I would grant them a permanent easement for free, with just one condition. They had to let me build a memorial garden on the unused portion of the lot. The memorial would honor Sarah and other residents who had passed away while living in Willowbrook Estates. It would be maintained at HOA expense and would include a plaque explaining that the garden existed thanks to the generosity of residents who believed in beauty over bureaucracy. Margaret fought the proposal for months. She tried to find alternative water sources, explore the possibility of relocating the main line, and even suggested that the city should handle the easement negotiations instead of the HOA. But the numbers didn't work. Installing a new water connection would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and take years to complete. The city had no obligation to get involved in private property disputes, and every month that passed without a signed easement agreement created more legal exposure for the HOA. Lenders, of course, would do nothing. They just collect a coal and move on. The other board members eventually overruled Margaret's objections. They voted to accept my proposal and fired Margaret as president for mishandling the situation so badly that it had created a financial crisis for the entire community. Construction on Sarah's memorial garden began the following spring. I worked with the same landscape designer who had helped create Sarah's original garden. We planted many of the same flowers, roses, lavender, sunflowers, and daisies, but we also added plants donated by other neighbors in memory of their own loved ones. Mrs. Henderson contributed peonies in memory of her husband. The family on Oak Street planted a Japanese maple for their son who died in military service. Even some of Margaret's former supporters participated, bringing plants and volunteering their time to help with the installation. The memorial garden is 5 times larger than Sarah's original garden ever was. It sits right at the neighborhood entrance, where everyone can see it every time they come home. The HOA maintains it year-round, and it's become a gathering place for neighbors who want to remember people they've lost. The plaque reads, Sarah's Memorial Garden, in memory of all who called Willowbrook Estates home, and in honor of those who believe that beauty makes life worth living. Margaret moved out of the neighborhood 6 months after the garden was finished. I heard she bought a house in a different suburb with an even stricter HOA. I hope she's happier there. The memorial garden is entering its second full growing season now. The butterflies are back, along with the hummingbirds and bees. Children from the neighborhood often stop to look at the flowers on their way to school. Their parents tell them about the lady who loved gardens so much that even after she was gone, she made sure there would always be flowers for everyone to enjoy. I visit Sarah's grave every Tuesday, the day she died. But I spend most of my time at the memorial garden, sitting on the bench we installed under the oak tree. I watch the seasons change and the flowers bloom, knowing that Sarah's dream of creating something beautiful that would outlast her came true in ways she never could have imagined. Honestly, I'd love to know how you'd handle something like this. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the best revenge isn't about winning or losing. It's about turning something destructive into something meaningful. Margaret thought she was protecting property values by destroying one small garden. Instead, she created the largest, most beautiful memorial garden our neighborhood has ever seen. She thought she was enforcing rules, but she ended up changing them forever. The HOA's new community guidelines specifically protect memorial gardens and other meaningful landscaping projects. They even created a beautification committee to encourage more creative gardening throughout the neighborhood. Sometimes I wonder if Sarah knew how everything would turn out. She always said that flowers have a way of growing back stronger after they've been cut down. She was talking about perennials at the time, but I think she might have been talking about something else too. The memorial garden proves that love is more powerful than bureaucracy, that beauty is worth fighting for, and that sometimes losing everything is just the beginning of creating something even better. Sarah would have loved seeing how her dream grew into something that brings joy to hundreds of people instead of just 2.